Chapter 1. Spring, 1856. Vicki Abigail Williams looked up when the front door opened. She was cooking supper for her family, and her mother and sisters were out planting the kitchen garden. Spring had come early there in Clover Creek for the first time since they'd settled there. To her surprise, it was Abigail Appleby. "Hi, Abby. Vicki, I wanted to let you know that the people who came back together, my best friend, Anna, and John among them, are finally here. I'm sure it'll be a few days before they're ready to talk to people, but they're here. Thought you might want to know." 2 marriages bound the Applebys and the Williams families, which made all of the Applebys feel like family to Vicki, though they really weren't. "That's nice," Vicki said, trying to sound casual as her heart jumped in her chest. She and John had talked for a long while when their company had been there in the fall. "I'm sure you're thrilled to have Anna back here." Abigail nodded. "I've never gone a full 6 months without seeing her before. I'm so glad she's here. I can't wait to share my life with her." Vicki smiled. "I'm so happy for you. And me. I'm happy for me. John is back. It's Friday, so I think they'll be at church Sunday. It's going to be hard, but I'm not going to try and see Anna before then. If she comes to me, that's one thing, but I won't go to her." Vicki nodded. "That makes sense. She'll be putting in a garden, I would think." Abigail nodded. "We spent the morning planting a garden ourselves. I should get back to it with the others, but I wanted to let you know because you seem to be sweet on John." Vicki blushed. "I wouldn't say sweet on him. I'd say I'm madly in love with him and want to have his babies." "I see," Abby said. And from the look on her face, Vicki knew she was completely aware of her feelings. "Okay, I'll get back to gardening then." Vicki finished peeling the potatoes for the stew she was making and then dumped them into the pot with the carrots, onions, and beef. She'd already browned the beef, and she added water and seasoning and moved the pot to the center of the stove. Then she went back outside to help with the garden. She'd go in every 30 minutes or so and make sure everything was cooking well, but she had to put in time working on the garden as well. Vicki joined her mother and younger sister Barbara in the garden and took a bag of carrot seeds to plant. "The strawberries look good," Vicki said. They would be the first fruit to pick and put up that year. She preferred gardening to cooking and sewing, but thanks to her sister-in-law Henri, she was now adept at cooking, and with her mother, she'd always been adept at sewing. She just preferred outdoor work to indoor, so she was happiest in the garden. "They do," Ma agreed. She wasn't one who enjoyed gardening, but she did it because her family liked to eat, and this was the only way to get fresh produce. Of course, they'd have to can a lot of it before long, so they could make it through the winter. Sometimes Vicki thought that all they did was prepare for winter, but if it made it so they could be comfortable, then it was worth it. She was happy growing carrots and everything else the garden would hold that summer. Then in the winter, she'd be making jerky and putting up the meats the men brought in. Henri, her brother Roy's wife, had taught her how to make meat last as long as possible, and she was thrilled to have the knowledge. Her parents were the proud owners of a cattle ranch along with her brother. They had claimed land beside one another so there would be more land for their venture. She liked to imagine what it would be like when she had her own homestead, and she shared a home with her husband, whomever he may be. Though she had to admit, if only to herself, that the future husband's face had become John's in the past few months. He wanted to start a farm in the valley, which she didn't know a great deal about, but she was willing to learn. There was good land all over. Perhaps he would choose to be a bit closer to the lake than she was with her parents. She couldn't imagine not seeing her family on a daily basis, but perhaps it would be good for her to be more independent. She had gotten used to cooking since they'd settled in Clover Creek, because Henri had taught them all how to cook. Ma couldn't cook to save her life, but she made the best jerky around. Vicki had learned to make jerky from her mother, and she knew she did a good job of it. She would continue to follow her mother's receipt once she was married. All she could think about was John being back in their community. Oh, how she wished she could hurry him into marriage, but she also wasn't sure that was wise. She would just make herself available for courting and see what happened from there. John had promised to come back and settle in their valley so he could get to know her better. Surely that meant he was as interested in a marriage between them as she was. At least she hoped it did. Life got more confusing as you got older, it seemed. After planting her row of carrots, she hurried back into the house to check her stew and gave it a few good stirs. Their first year in Clover Creek had been spent in a small log cabin. Thankfully, 2 of her siblings had moved out immediately, but that was still leaving 4 people in a small cabin. 2 years before, her father had built them a real house, and for the first time in her life, she had her own bedroom. She hurried back out and was given a bag of potato quarters, which she immediately began planting. Putting in a kitchen garden would take her mother, and Barbara at least a week. It was a lot of work, and Vicki was just glad she loved it so much. She was bent over putting a potato quarter into the hole she'd just dug and covering it with dirt when a horse and rider stopped in front of the house. She was wearing her bonnet, but still needed to shade her eyes to see who was there. Once she realized who it was, her heart stopped for just a moment. She set the bag of potatoes down and walked to John, who was dismounting from his horse. "John, you're back. Did you get land around here?" Vicki asked. She was thrilled to see him. He nodded. "I did. It's out closer to the lake. Most of the land immediately surrounding the town is gone." "I'm sure it is," she said. "We have at least 30 companies coming through every year, and they each have around 30 wagons. It makes sense to pick a spot near a growing town." He nodded. "I wondered if we could go for a walk." She bit her lip. "Let me ask my ma. We're supposed to be putting in our kitchen garden, and I'm cooking supper as well. Let me just help with the garden then. I know I shouldn't have come over quite so soon, but I was hoping to see you, and make sure the beauty I remember is just the same." She smiled. "And? You've exceeded all expectations. Come meet my ma." Vicki walked toward her mother, who had stopped planting to watch her with John. "Ma, this is John. I met him in the fall. He was part of Abby's wagon train." Ma smiled. "It's nice to meet you. I hope you'll enjoy living in Clover Creek. He's going to be a farmer here." Ma nodded. "And you want to court my daughter?" she asked, making Vicki blush. Her mother could be so blunt at times when a little finesse was called for. John nodded. "Yes, ma'am, if that's all right with you. You'll have to ask my husband, but you can stay for supper tonight if you'd like. Abigail cooked, so I'm certain it will be good." "That would be nice," he said with a smile. "Are you going to come back in an hour, or stay here?" "If you don't mind, I'll help Vicki with the planting." Ma nodded, and went back to work, but Vicki knew her ma was watching her. As they walked back to her bag of potato quarters, he frowned. "Isn't your name Victoria?" he asked. She nodded. "Most folks call me Vicki, but my family calls me Abigail, which is my middle name." "Ah, so would you rather I called you Abigail or Vicki?" "I prefer Vicki." She picked up the bag of potatoes, realizing then her backside had been in the air when he'd rode up. Apparently, it hadn't bothered him enough to say anything. As they worked, she asked him about his plans. "Are you going to be a crop farmer? Or a dairy farmer?" "Dairy. I brought 8 cows with me, and 1 bull. Should be enough to at least get started. All 8 cows are expecting any day." She smiled. "That's a lot of milk right there. You'll build up your dairy quickly, I'll bet." "I hope so. You have a dock in town, right?" She nodded. "We do. He's good too. I've had to see him for the flu. Glad to hear he's good. I want to be able to go for him if one of the cows gets in trouble nursing. Yeah, I've heard he's good with animals as well, but since I'm not an animal, I have no way to be sure. He chuckled. Glad to hear you're not an animal. She grinned. I'm glad you chose to settle here. It's a good community, with good people. It's not big yet, and I hope it never is, but it's big enough. We have a store, and a sawmill, and even a boarding house. He nodded. I'm staying in the boarding house until I have my house finished. I'm going to build a little one-room house over a cellar, and then when I want to expand, it'll be easy. You're not starting with a log cabin, she asked, surprise coloring her voice. I don't want to put that kind of effort in twice. I started the cellar yesterday, as soon as I got here, and I ordered my lumber from the sawmill. The food at the boarding house is excellent, so I'm eating most of my meals there. Mrs. Pruitt even packs me a lunch when I say I'm working all day. She's a nice lady. Vicki nodded, smiling. I don't know her well, but my interactions with her have all been good. I'm not surprised. Her little girls are just delightful. Vicki nodded. I've spent more time with her girls than I have with her. We all walked the trail together, of course, and the girls would sometimes find us and walk with us. It was fun to see them. I was only 15 then, and Barbara was only 12. Barbara is your sister? He asked. Is she the one I met? Vicki shook her head. Okay, here's where it gets a little confusing. My older brother married the only girl from the Appleby family. Then my older sister married the oldest boy from the family. They live right above us on the hill, so we've sort of become just one big family in some ways. The girl you met was Abby, who was part of your wagon train, and she married the youngest of the Appleby boys. Oh. So she's not related to you at all? Not at all. But it feels like she is in some ways, if that makes sense at all. When we do a big family meal, both families and all offspring show up. Usually, Henri cooks though. She taught me to cook, but my ma's cooking is terrible. I heard that, her ma yelled back at her. Am I lying? Vicki called back. She's telling you the truth, Barbara called. But ma makes the best jerky in the whole area. Jerky? He asked. I had a lot of jerky on the trail, but it's always been one of my favorite things. He looked at Vicki with his head tilted to one side. Does that mean you make good jerky? She nodded. Almost as good as ma's. John smiled. I'll have to sample it one day. Vicki nodded. I need to run in and make sure the stew isn't burning. Come with me, and I'll get you some. He didn't have to be told twice. I'm working hard to get my house ready. I hope I can marry once it's done. You know anyone in the area who wouldn't mind marrying a farmer? She grinned at him but shook her head. Don't know anyone at all. I hope you can find someone. I hope I can too. Having a wife to cook and clean for me would be wonderful. And garden, Vicki said. I do love to garden. Really? He asked. That could be helpful too. But can you sew? She nodded, holding her arms out to each side. I made this. That's beautiful. You really can sew. My mom makes up for her lack of ability with cooking with her sewing. She's the best seamstress around. I can see that, he grinned. She went to the large jar that held some jerky, which was always kept filled, and put some in a small cloth sack. There. Now you know how good I am at making jerky, and since you're staying for supper, you can try my cooking. That sounds good to me. If your pa agrees, I want to court you. She smiled. I'd like that a lot. Really? He asked. I won't have a lot of time as I build my house and barn, but I'd love to see you whenever I can. Of course, she said. I've been hoping you'd make it back to Clover Creek and be able to settle here. I was too. I was a little dismayed when I saw that all the plots of land close to town were taken, but I liked my proximity to the lake. I'll have better access to water for my cattle. I can't wait to see your land. Perhaps your pa will let me drive you out there after church on Sunday. We could stop at the boarding house for lunch and then drive out to see what I've done so far on my property. I'm pretty sure he'll allow it. Once he's spent a little time with you, he'll know you're safe for me to be alone with. John liked that idea. He couldn't wait to talk to her father. Chapter 2. When Pa got back from his day on the ranch, he studied John for a moment. "You've settled here?" he asked. John nodded. "Yes, sir. I met your daughter Vicki back in October, and I'm hoping you'll allow me to court her." "I don't know you," Pa said. "Can't say yes or no until I do. Your wife invited me to supper." "Perhaps you can get to know me as we eat," John replied. Vicki held her breath as she watched the exchange. Her pa came across as gruff, but inside, he was as soft as a dandelion. When everyone sat down to supper, Vicki was glad she'd cooked. Any man who tried her ma's cooking would run as fast as he could away from her. She'd even baked bread that day, so he could try her fresh bread, which always turned out well. Pa said the prayer, and then Ma served him, John, herself, and the two girls. Vicki quickly took her first bite of the stew, praying it had turned out well. When it was good, she sighed happily. Ma buttered bread for everyone, asking how many pieces people wanted. Her pa always asked for 4, because he had gone years and years without bread thanks to Ma's inability to cook. Once John, who sat beside her on the bench that had been made for her and her sisters, had his bread and stew, he dipped a small piece of the bread into the stew and took a bite. "This is delicious," he said. Barbara nodded. "Only because Ma didn't cook. Abby always cooks now, because she's the best cook in the house." Ma frowned. "Everyone was happy with my cooking until Henri made a meal for us. Then they all wanted me to cook like her. I can cook a few more things than I could before, but the girls have really done well with their cooking." Vicki didn't meet John's gaze, but she was inwardly delighted at the praise. "I made pie tonight too," she said softly. Barbara grinned. "I love your pie." "You just love pie," Vicki responded. John smiled at Barbara. "I'm with you. I love pie." "No one loves it as much as Bastian," Barbara said. "I'm surprised he hasn't turned into a giant pie. Ma always says you are what you eat. Though, we should have all been giant hunks of burnt, dried-out meat, if that was true." Pa looked at Barbara. "That's enough. I'd rather not hear anyone make fun of my wife's cooking. She kept us all alive." "That's true," Vicki said, ready to stick up for her mother. "What are you planning on farming?" Pa asked John. John nervously swallowed before answering. "Dairy cattle," he said quickly. "I have 8 cows to start and 1 bull. I expect to have many calves in the next few weeks." "Sounds good. And your plot is out near the lake?" Pa asked. John nodded. "It's a 30-minute drive, but I'll come into town often, especially for church." Pa nodded. "Glad to hear you're a church-going man. Have you started your cabin yet?" "I've started the cellar for the house I'll build, and I've ordered the lumber from the lumber mill. Until I get it built, I'm staying at the boarding house Margaret Pruitt runs. She's an excellent cook." "And you came into town to visit a young lady before you had the cellar built?" "I wanted to make sure Miss Vicki knew I was back here and she didn't agree to court anyone else. I'll spend the rest of the week finishing up the cellar and then start building. I need to build a house, barn, and fences. Many around here don't bother with fences. They just make sure they have their cattle branded so we know who it belongs to. You're in a community full of God-fearing men and women. There's no danger of cattle being rustled." Glad to hear it. I'll do that then. Maybe the fences can wait. I'd sure build the barn before fences, Pa said. Your cattle will need a warm place this winter. Yes, sir. I'll make sure I do that. And you want to court my Vicki? John met Pa's eyes straight on. I would very much like your permission to court her. Pa thought about it for a moment. I think that'll be fine. Don't keep her out late, and make sure you always tell me where you're going. I'd like to take her for a drive after church on Sunday. I want to show her my land, and take her to lunch at the boarding house. Pa nodded. That'll be fine. Eat most of your meals with us though. No use wasting money that you don't have to spend. Thank you, sir. After supper, John took her for a walk. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time alone today. Your sister does the dishes? He asked. Since I cooked, Ma will wash while Barbara wipes. If Barbara had cooked, I'd be washing and Ma would be wiping. We try to keep the work fair to all of us. As soon as they were out of view of the house, he took her hand. Do you mind? He asked. She shook her head. I don't mind at all. Her mother had always been very open with her and her sisters about the marriage bed and what to expect. It sounded like something wonderful to hear Ma tell about it, and she didn't feel shy about holding hands or even kissing. Your family is back east? She asked. He nodded. They are. In West Virginia. I finished school and worked for the past 6 years as a coal miner. Because I lived at home, I was able to save up a good sum of money, and I used that to come west. Ma and Pa have 8 other children, and they told me to live a good life. I'll be writing Ma this week to let them know I've made it to my destination and I'm starting to build. Just writing your Ma? She asked. That seemed weird. She knew she'd be writing a letter to the entire family. Pa doesn't read, he said softly. So I'll write Ma, and she'll read it to all of them. It works that way. Sounds like it. She felt sad for his years in a coal mine. From what she understood, mining was difficult, dirty, and didn't pay well. They reached a wooded area not far from the house, and she turned to him. I know this will seem forward, but Ma has told me that touch is an important part of marriage. She said if you don't see fireworks in your mind when a man kisses you, he's not worth your time. So I wondered if you'd kiss me, so I could see if I see fireworks. He chuckled. I was walking along, holding your hand, wondering if you would be offended if I asked for a kiss. I guess not. She grinned. I don't believe I would be offended. He leaned down and brushed his lips across hers, very gently. When he went to lift his head, she'd wrapped her arms around him and held him in place, and she deepened the kiss. Her tongue stroked against his lips and then just a bit inside. He thought his body would explode at the touch of her tongue, and he opened his mouth to share a more passionate kiss. When he finally raised his head, he was out of breath, and more than a little aroused. This girl packed a punch. She stood out of breath as well, just looking at him. I think I saw so much more than fireworks. He chuckled softly. As did I. I don't think there's any worry about us being physically compatible. No, not at all, she said softly. I wasn't expecting to feel quite so much. Her whole body felt differently as he touched it. Her nipples felt a bit sore and felt him all the way to her core. He was the right man. There was no doubt in her mind. As they walked back, he still held her hand, and though it had felt exciting and new all the way to the wooded area, it now felt like it wasn't enough. He wanted more kisses, and he wanted a lot more than kisses. He didn't know if he'd be able to wait to make love with her until after their house was built. I'll spend all day tomorrow digging my cellar, and then I'll see you at church on Sunday, and we'll go for that drive after church. I'd like that a lot, she said, swaying toward him. If your pa sees me kissing you goodnight, will he come after me with a rifle? Vicki giggled. No, he's very much like my mother about these things. He'd probably watch to see if he thought you were the right man for me. My parents were very different than yours, he said softly. But if you don't mind, he lowered his head to hers for another kiss, and Vicki wrapped her arms around him. When he raised his head, she looked as dazed as he felt. I'll see you at church Sunday. Sleep sweet. Vicki sighed happily. You too. I'm off to milk the cows and then get to the boarding house. I'll be up extra early tomorrow so I can get that house built just as fast as I can. Sounds wonderful, she said softly. Dream of me. I'm sure I will. But his dreams would likely not be the platonic dreams of a young girl like her. His dreams would be of their wedding night, and all he wanted to do to her body. It was hard to act like a gentleman when he wanted to do so much more with her than kiss. She went inside and closed the door behind them, a smile on her face. She walked toward her bedroom, thinking of calling it a night, and she could dream of him. Oh, would she dream of him? Her mother followed her into her bedroom. That kiss looked like you were very happy with John. Vicki turned her back to her mother to have her unbutton her dress. It was wonderful. I want to marry him, Ma. And you met in the fall? Why haven't you mentioned him? I wasn't certain he'd really move here, even though he said he would. We talked for a few minutes one time. How was I to know he wanted to marry me? He's mentioned marriage already? Vicki frowned for a moment thinking. Yes, he has. For a minute I wasn't sure if he'd mentioned marriage, or if I'd just been thinking about it since he arrived. Ma shook her head. You are your mother's daughter. Will you see him tomorrow? Vicki shook her head. No, not until Sunday at church. He's going to spend the whole day tomorrow, digging his cellar. He said he wants the house done as soon as possible. You'll be able to marry faster, Ma agreed. All right. Just making sure you have the feelings for him you think you have. Kissing him was like being in the middle of a war, with shots and cannons going off all around me, Vicki said. Then he's the right man for you. There's no question about it. I'll only have one baby left at home by fall, I guess. That baby is growing up fast, Vicki said. She's only 3 years younger than me. Don't remind me. I can't believe how quickly you're all marrying and moving out. It's time, Vicki said. John is the man I've been waiting for. Good. Then I won't have to worry about you going for that ride with him on Sunday. Just remember, keep your legs closed until you have made your vows in front of the preacher. Vicki nodded. I will. Though, I have a feeling, it won't be easy. Vicki climbed into bed, and though she'd always tried to be a good girl, her mind went to the man she'd spent her evening with. John. He was everything to her. Her present and her future. She pulled out her journal that she denied keeping to her sister Barbara, who was always looking for it to read. She kept it under her mattress though. She carefully wrote the day's date. April 20, Sup/Sup, 1856. John has settled here in Clover Creek. Well, near Clover Creek. He came today, to tell me he was here, and to ask my pa to allow him to court me. Pa wasn't here, so he stayed for supper and Pa agreed after talking with him for a while. And then John took me for the most heavenly walk. Or maybe it was a sinful walk? I suppose it depends on who you ask. He held my hand until we reached the woods, and there I asked him to kiss me. I know it was brazen, and forward, and all the other things girls aren't supposed to be, but I wanted to be sure we were physically compatible before we married. His kiss made me see not only fireworks, but an entire display of all of the most advanced weapons. He's the man for me. I just know it. Tomorrow, he'll spend the entire day digging the cellar for our house, and then Sunday, we'll see one another at church, and go for a drive after church. I do hope he'll sit with my family. I know Ma won't let me just up and sit with only him, but sitting with our family would be fine in her eyes. He plans to take me to the boarding house for lunch, and I've never had a meal that was paid for and not cooked by family or a friend, so that is very exciting. And then we'll go and see his homestead, and I'll get to see where I'll live for the rest of my life. I'm going to marry John Abbot. You just wait and see. She hugged her journal to her chest before tucking it away between her mattress and the wall, where it had been kept since the last time Barbara found it. As she closed her eyes, she imagined what her day out with John would be like. A whole day with the man she loved. What could be better than that? She found herself a bit too excited to sleep. John was back in Clover Creek, and he still had feelings for her, as she did for him. She only prayed he could work quickly to get the house done. Vicki was more than ready to move in. Chapter 3. By Sunday, John had his cellar dug out, and he'd gotten his first delivery of wood from the sawmill. He would be able to start building his home on Monday morning, and he was thrilled. It shouldn't take him more than 2 or 3 weeks to get the house built, and then he could marry Vicki. If her father consented, of course, but it seemed as if he would. As he drove into town on Sunday, in his nicest clothes, he hoped that Vicki would be allowed to sit with him. He wanted everyone to know that she would be his. When he arrived at church, she was already there, sitting with her mother. She spotted him and smiled, which was a good sign in his mind. He walked over and smiled. "Would it be all right if Vicki sat with me?" he asked. Her mother shook her head immediately. "No, our unmarried daughters sit with us," Ma said. "Would it be all right if he sat with us? I could sit on the other end of the pew with him on the aisle." "Please, Ma?" Vicki knew it was the best they could hope for. Ma nodded. "Yes, but if I hear the two of you whispering even once, you won't sit together before you marry." "Yes, Ma," Vicki said, knowing her mother meant every word. She scooted to the far end of the pew, and when he sat beside her, she explained. "I knew she wouldn't let me sit away from the family, but I hoped the two of us would be allowed to sit together if we sat with the family. I hope that's all right." "Definitely." "I didn't realize such a small difference would change her mind." He took her hand and squeezed it, but promptly let it go when he saw her father looking at them. She giggled. "My parents are really strict when it comes to what we do in church." "I see that," he said. "I'm just going to sit here and be as well behaved as possible," John said. "I'm excited to go to the boarding house for lunch. I've never eaten anywhere but with family and friends. It'll be a new experience." He nodded. "I think you'll like it." "No doubt in my mind," she said. "I'm excited to show you my homestead. There's not much there yet, but I think you'll like its proximity to Bear Lake." "I know I will," she said, smiling at him. "We're talking like us getting married is going to happen, and we haven't even courted yet." "I'll court you today, and marry you tomorrow," he said, winking at her. She laughed. "I'm not so sure about that. I think we may need to court just a little longer to satisfy my family," but Emma and Jared didn't court long. "Emma is your sister?" he asked. She nodded. "The only one older than me." "How long do you think your pa will want us to court?" he asked. "I think I can have the house built in a couple of weeks." "Will your father be all right with that?" "I think so. For our family, that's a long courtship." He laughed at that. "I'm not going to worry then. I'll make sure we spend every Sunday together, and maybe I can go to your house for supper on Wednesday nights. Then I can see you twice a week. I hate that I can't make it more, but building the house needs to be my first priority." "I agree, and I know my father does. Marrying once the house is built sounds wonderful." The pastor made announcements after church that morning, and he said the annual spring dance would be held the next Saturday evening. "That means all you ladies need to make your best meals, and we'll eat together, and we'll have music and dancing afterward." Vicki was excited. It would be her first time to be able to attend the dance with a beau. At least she hoped John would be able to take her. As soon as the closing prayer was over, John looked at her. "Will you go to the spring dance with me?" "I thought you'd never ask," she said, grinning. He stood and spent a minute talking to her pa to be certain it was all right if he took her to the dance. Pa nodded. "That would be fine. I'd like you to have Abby home by supper time, and you can stay for supper if you'd like." "Who's cooking?" John asked, a twinkle in his eye. "Barbara. We do our best to be sure my sweet wife doesn't have to sweat in front of a stove. I'll have her back by 6. Does that work for you, sir?" Pa nodded. "Absolutely. Be good." John offered Vicki his arm and led her out to his wagon. "We'll go to lunch first." He helped her into the wagon before running around and climbing behind the horses. As he drove over to the boarding house, he grinned at her. "I'm excited to have a day to spend with you. I've been hoping you'd come back and court me since we met in October." He nodded. "I've felt the same. I'm glad I'm here." At the boarding house, he helped her down. Mrs. Pruitt said to go on in, but lunch would take at least 30 minutes after she got home from church. "That's fine," Vicki said. "I'm excited to spend time with you without my family watching over me." They went inside and he chose a table off in one corner of the room. "This looks good to me." She nodded. To her surprise, Jamie Pruitt, Margaret's husband, walked around with a pot of coffee and a pitcher of water, filling drinks for anyone who wanted them. "We're having beef roast for lunch today," he told them when he got to their table. "Would you prefer it as a sandwich, or on its own with carrots and potatoes?" Vicki nodded. "I think I'd like it as a sandwich." Jamie nodded. "We serve it open-faced with mashed potatoes on the side and gravy over all of it." "Sounds delicious," Vicki said. "I'll have the same," John said. After Jamie left, Vicki asked, "Are all the meals here so fine?" He nodded. "I've always loved chicken and dumplings, and I think Mrs. Pruitt makes the best chicken and dumplings I've ever tasted. I'll get Henri to teach me to make them, so you can have them at home too." He smiled. "I'd like that a lot." "And Henri is married to your brother?" She nodded. "She and Roy married when we first settled here, and they have 3 small children now. She's expecting again, so she's exempt from garden duties." "She doesn't work while she's expecting?" he asked, surprised. "There are 4 families who share a garden up on the hill, and they are able to work around whoever is pregnant. Even their father, Mr. Appleby, recently remarried and his wife had a child, but they don't think they'll have more children. Melody is already in her 40s. He nodded. "I guess if it works for them, that's good." "I sure think so," Vicki said. "They enjoy one another's company a great deal. I feel left out sometimes." "Have you asked to be included?" he asked, frowning. He didn't like the idea of her not being able to do what she wanted with people she cared about. She shook her head. "No, I haven't. Ma needs me to help with the chores, and I just don't feel that I should stick my nose in where it doesn't belong." "Do you know Anna and her husband?" he asked. "They were part of our company, and I know they know Abigail." "Oh, she's Abby's best friend," Vicki said. "I remember meeting her. Her homestead is right next to mine. They're dairy farmers as well. I think the 2 of you could spend time together after we marry." She smiled. "I'd like that a lot. If she's friends with Abigail, then I'm sure we'll have fun together." The food was just as good as he'd said it was. "This is delicious," she told Margaret when she came by to make sure they were happy with their meals. Margaret smiled. "Thank you, Vicki. I do love to cook." "You kept all the single men in our company alive on the trek here," Vicki said. "Even after you married, you were still cooking for many of the men." Margaret nodded. I got free meat in exchange, so it all worked out. After they'd left the boarding house, he pointed the horse in the direction of the lake. Are you on this side of the lake or the other side? She asked. This side, but just barely. I have to go the long way around. She nodded. All right. Let's go see this amazing property of yours. She loved to swim, and she almost told him that, but she was afraid to. She usually swam in her drawers, and her mother wouldn't like her telling him that. As they drove, he talked about his family back in West Virginia while she discussed her grandparents back home. Are you glad your family brought you all this way? He asked. I didn't enjoy the walking as much as I could have, but I'm glad we're here now. Pa is able to do what he's always wanted to do. Back east, he worked in a factory, which he hated. I feel the same. I have been saving to come out here for a long time, and I made sure I had some pocket money as well. Oregon Territory must be the most beautiful place on earth. It is, she said. I wouldn't go back east if you paid me. And I certainly wouldn't walk back east. He shook his head. I drove, of course, so I didn't spend nearly as much time walking as you did, but that journey was hard. I had someone ask me if I'd go back and bring another group out here as their captain, and I said no. It was too much, and I want to get my dairy farm off the ground. I'm excited to have Anna as a neighbor, she said. I know she and Abby were always really close, and that means she's a good person, because Abby would never be friends with anyone who wasn't. Her husband is very nice, he said. We worked together keeping watch over the herd a few times on the way out here. Did you travel with them back here from Oregon City? He nodded. I did. It was nice to not have to travel alone. There were a couple of other wagons coming this way as well, and the 4 wagons followed each other. It felt so much safer. Did you have trouble? She asked. He shook his head. I was warned that the Indians were riled up, and they would attack small parties, but it never happened. I don't know why they were even saying that. I'm just glad you didn't run into trouble, she said. I would have been very sad if you hadn't made it back. It's very strange, this connection I feel to you, he said. We spent 20 minutes talking to each other 6 months ago, and it's like we made a commitment to each other. She nodded emphatically. I feel the same way. I guess we're just meant to be together, he said. We are, she told him. I can feel it deep inside me. He stopped in front of a huge hole in the ground not 100 yards away from the lake. This is my land, he said. I'm building beside the lake because it will be easier to tote water, but my land stretches way out that way. He pointed south toward Clover Creek. I think you picked a very good spot, she said. Anna and her husband? He pointed toward the east. It won't even be a 5-minute walk between our homes, he said, smiling at her. I'm so excited, she said. I can't wait to get to know Anna, and I love your homestead. We'll have beautiful views of the lake every single day. He nodded. I think I picked a good spot. I'm really surprised no one took it. We all liked the Clover Creek area so much that we couldn't stray this far, she said with a smile. I only wish I'd been old enough to get my own land. Then we'd have double. This land is plenty for my purposes. We don't need more. Maybe in 50 years we will, but I'd rather not even think about that now. She took a step closer to him. I think you should kiss me on the land we'll work together as husband and wife, she said softly. I'll kiss you anywhere and anytime you want, he said, lowering his head toward hers. His kiss made her forget where they were, and why they were there. It truly made her feel like she was the most desirable woman in all of Oregon Territory. When he lifted his head, she sighed happily. Soon we won't have to stop, and we can really make love, she said. He blinked a couple of times. We shouldn't be talking about that, he said. Probably not, but only the two of us know. What difference does it make? I suppose the world won't end. He walked her toward the bench he'd made. This is going in front of the house, he said, sitting down and patting the seat beside him. You're not afraid of lovemaking? She shook her head adamantly. My mother has always been very open about it, she said. She's explained everything, and she calls it one of God's greatest blessings. He shook his head. My ma sure doesn't talk to my younger sisters about it that way, he said. I think I like the way your ma does things better than mine. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Me too. There's no reason for a young lady to be afraid of her wedding night. I'm thinking very positively about mine and wishing it could happen sooner. I'll build as quickly as I can. I'm sure looking forward to our wedding night as well. She picked up her head and looked at John. Are we engaged? I would say we are, he said. I'll talk to your pa and see if he'll give me permission to ask you. I think he will, she said. He's ready to have one less mouth to feed. Has he said that? John asked, surprised. Vicki shook her head. No, he hasn't said it, but each time one of my siblings marries, I can feel the difference in our family income. I think he'll be happy. Chapter 4. On the way back to Clover Creek, they talked about their future and what each of them wanted. I want at least a dozen children, Vicki said with a smile, looking off into the distance. I think 5 is enough for me, John said. Really? Don't farmers all want big families to help on the farm? He shrugged. There were too many kids to feed in my family growing up. We did good to have meat on our table once a month, and the rest of the time, we ate beans. But it won't be like that for us, she said. I'll always plant a good kitchen garden, and we'll always have milk. My family will share the meat they hunt, and I expect we will too. I've learned to feed a family on little because of the trail, and I'm sure I'll be able to do better than your ma did. He nodded. My ma never had a kitchen garden. We didn't live in a place with enough land for a garden. I think it was one of the ways the mine kept their people close. They didn't ever let people leave. That's sad. Did you feel like you were owned by the mine? My pa did. All of the money he earned went right back to the company store for more money than we'd have paid anywhere else. But it was hard to get anywhere else, because we weren't wealthy enough to have animals. When I started working the mine, I'd pay my ma 10% of my salary, and the rest went to my savings. But I figured I owed money to the family for my keep. Even though I did share a room with my 5 brothers. That's a big family. 3 sisters then? He nodded. Ma always regretted when she was expecting. I was the oldest, and she cried on my shoulder more times than I could count. He shook his head. I don't ever want you to be in a position where you start crying at the idea of having another baby. I don't see that happening, but once we have a few, we can make that decision, she said. She hadn't come from the kind of extreme poverty he was talking about, and she may feel more like he did later on. What about the house? Do you want a big house or a small house? He shrugged. I'll add on as we need to, he said. Right now, I'm planning a house with 1 room, so the bedroom, kitchen, and dining room will all be one big room. Then as babies start to come, I can add on 1 room at a time. That sounds perfect. We spent our first winter here in a cabin, and it was 4 of us just like now. I do love having my own room now, though. He smiled. I'm sure you do. I love having my own room in the boarding house. I stayed in one in Oregon City as well, but it was the first time I'd ever had a room of my own. Very strange feeling. Maybe marrying isn't a good idea then. John's head whipped around as he looked at her. Why would you say that? Because then we wouldn't have our own rooms. Trust me, I'd rather share a room with you where we can make love as often as we want than have my own. Any day. She smiled. I like the sound of that. Good. Don't scare me like that. Vicki laughed. Sorry, but it was fun. So you like to tease, don't you? He asked. She nodded emphatically. I love to tease. My family always teases each other. It makes me feel loved. I'll have to remember that. When they reached her house, he quickly helped her down from the wagon and offered her his arm as they walked into the house. Did you have a good time? Ma called. Vicki smiled and nodded emphatically. Lunch was wonderful. I've always heard Margaret Pruitt was a good cook, and she definitely lives up to her reputation. I love his little homestead, which is right there on the banks of Bear Lake. That sounds lovely, Ma said. I'm glad you had such a good time. Well, the company was wonderful, and that helped, Vicki said, smiling at John. It sounds like it, Ma said. See if your sister needs help with supper. Vicki nodded, hurrying into the kitchen. Need any help? She asked. Barbara nodded. I'm not as good about getting everything ready at the same time as you are, she said. I have the chicken done, but the potatoes still need to be mashed, and I need to make gravy. Do you want to mash, or make the gravy? I'll make the gravy, Vicki said, remembering how bad her sister's last attempt at gravy had turned out. Good. I hate making gravy. I kind of enjoy it, Vicki said honestly. Not that I enjoy cooking a great deal, but you know what I mean. 5 minutes later, the gravy was made, and the potatoes had been mashed. Vicki carried a bowl of gravy to the table, noticing John was talking to her pa, which made her a little nervous. Barbara carried the potatoes to the table, and Vicki went back for the bread. Since Henri had taught Vicki and Barbara to make bread, they hadn't gone a night without it on their supper table. When everything was ready, Barbara called the family to supper, and John came inside with a smile on his face. Vicki said a silent prayer that it meant that Pa had given permission for them to marry as soon as the house was built. Oh, how she hoped that was the case. After the prayer, they passed the chicken around, and everyone filled their plates. This looks really good, Barbara, Vicki said. Almost good enough to eat. Barbara stuck her tongue out at Vicki, and John laughed. It's like being at home with my family, he said. How many siblings do you have? Ma asked him. I'm the oldest of 9, he said. My father is a coal miner in West Virginia. Coal mines are some of the hardest work there is, Pa said. John nodded. I mined for several years before I came west. I'm surprised you've been able to scrub off the coal, Pa said with a smile. You must have left at least a year ago. John smiled, nodding. It took a good long while, that's for sure. For a while, I looked like a raccoon from the eye covering I wore down there. Pa laughed. I've heard of that. Glad I never had to do that job. I was a factory worker back east, and all I could think of was being a rancher. Thankfully my son Roy wanted the same thing, and we are working together to make it happen. Ranching is hard work too, John said. I'm not sure I could do it. I'm very happy to have my small herd of cattle though. And one more heifer was born last night, so I have 9 now. Pa nodded. Which is great. Every extra heifer you get will help. What are you going to do with the young males? Castrate them and use them for food in the fall, John said. From what I understand, my future wife has a good understanding of how to preserve meat. Ma looked at Vicki and smiled, nodding. She can do just about anything in the kitchen, she said proudly. Vicki sighed. Did I miss out on a marriage proposal just because my pa said yes? She asked. I think I deserve a proposal. Barbara grinned and clapped her hands. Me too. I want to see it. Ma shook her head. A proposal is a private matter, and Abby doesn't need her little sister watching. I always get confused when you call her Abby, John said. To me, she's always been Vicki. I don't remember why we started calling her Abigail, but it suits her. Victoria was my ma's name, and she died when I was little, so I wanted to have one girl named after her. I like to pretend that I was named after Queen Victoria, Vicki said. Makes me feel like I'm more important than I am. You're a great deal more important to me than the Queen, John said. I wouldn't know her if I saw her. Vicki smiled and squeezed John's hand under the table. You're so sweet to me. I try, he said, grinning. I'm building the house as close to the lake as I can without being in the flood zone. I don't want Vicki to have to walk very far as she fetches water for her chores. Ma smiled at that. I like that you're thinking of her, even before you marry. Oh, trust me. I am. As soon as supper was over, John caught her hand. We're going for a very quick minute, but then I'll bring her back so she can help with the dishes. Ma nodded. That would be appreciated. Barbara doesn't like to pull cooking and dish duty. No one does, Vicki said as she followed John outside. Thank you for a lovely day, John said, leaning down and kissing her softly. Then he asked in a low voice. Will you marry me? I would be delighted, she said. It's just nice to be asked. He kissed her once more. I'll be here for supper on Wednesday. She nodded. We usually eat at 6. Sounds good. I'll see you then. With one more quick kiss, he climbed onto his wagon and drove away. She was glad he'd seen to the milking for the evening before they headed back to town. Now she knew he would only need to drive down to the boarding house that night. She walked back into the house and immediately went to the kitchen. Barbara followed her in. Well, she asked. He asked me to marry him, and I said yes, she said. He's hoping to have his house done in the next couple of weeks, and as soon as it's done, we'll speak our vows at the church. We need to make you a wedding dress, Ma said. She'd already boiled the water, so Vicki poured it into the sink and started washing the dishes. I would like you to wear a white dress, just like Queen Victoria, but it's just not practical for a farmer's wife to have a white dress. I agree, Vicki said softly. Maybe a dark blue? Or even a pink? Pink would show more stains, but it would be a church dress for a few years before you'd wear it doing chores. I think pink would be fine, if that's the color you want. It is, Vicki said. Pink had always been her favorite color. Barbara stayed in the kitchen so she could discuss the wedding with her mother and sister. Am I your bridesmaid? Please say yes. I hadn't even thought about a bridesmaid, Vicki said. Do you have time to make 2 new dresses, Ma? Ma nodded. If you and your sister see to the garden and all the cooking, I'll make sure that both dresses are made. Vicki smiled. Sounds like a good arrangement to me. And after I marry, I can put in a kitchen garden on John's homestead. I have extra seeds that we'll put in your hope chest. Vicki had a real hope chest before they came west, but her father wouldn't agree to taking a chest for each of them, so they now had bags full of their hope chest belongings. That would be wonderful, Ma. Thank you. Ma nodded. We didn't have time to do anything when we were planning Emma's wedding. It's going to be better this time. 2 weeks is enough time for me to even plan a nice meal for anyone who comes to the wedding. Are you going to cook? Vicki asked. Of course not. We'll call on the Appleby women to help us. You know they'll do it with smiles on their faces. Yes, they will, Vicki said, getting excited about having a wedding supper. I want to serve chicken and dumplings. Ma frowned. Have you ever had chicken and dumplings? Vicki shook her head. No, I haven't, but I know that they're John's favorite meal, and I want him to have it for our wedding supper. Ma nodded. That works. We'll get the receipt from Henri, and it will be fine. Now, do we want a wedding cake? Vicki thought about it for a moment. I don't think so. It's a lot of work for whoever is making it, and I know it would be costly. Having the chicken and dumplings will be enough. We can ask some of our friends to bring bread as well, and then we can have bread with our chicken and dumplings. Vicki nodded. I think that's a great idea. I hate asking for favors, but that makes a lot of sense. Sounds good, Ma said. And I'll make your wedding night nightgown like I did for your sister. I would love that, Ma. Vicki could remember the beautiful laced bodice nightgown her mother had made for Emma. She knew it would make John very happy to see her in it. Is there anything else you need? Ma asked. Curtains and a tablecloth. I'm sure I can make them, but you asked, so I'm answering. That'll be easy. We'll wait until John finishes the house and builds your table. Then you can make sure to make them the right size. What are we missing? Vicki shrugged. I'd like to spend a day with Henri and get her to give me receipts I can write down, she said. That's the only other thing I feel like I'll need right away. That's easy enough. You know Henri will be excited to help. I'll make sure you take home some jerky, and some of the canned goods we put up from the garden last year. Oh, good, Vicki said. I'll start a kitchen garden right away, but I won't be able to get any of the berries this year. Perhaps you'll share? You know we will. I'm very happy for you, Abby. It seems to me like John is the young man you've been waiting for. I know he is, Vicki said with a smile. I hate that we'll spend so much time apart for the next couple of weeks, but it makes sense that he has to focus on the house and not on me. The time will fly by, because you'll be double busy at home, Ma said. I'll make certain of it. Vicki laughed. That would be good. I know I need to stay busy so I don't think about him every minute of every day. Oh, you'll still think about him, Ma said. Chapter 5. Vicki found herself living for the days she would see John. When he came to supper that Wednesday evening, he told her of the progress he'd made on the house. The walls are up and the roof is on. I need to get a cook stove in there and make you a work table for the kitchen. And I need to make a table for us to eat at. I can make benches easily, but not chairs. Do you know of anyone who could make chairs for us? Elmer King, she said automatically. He's a furniture maker, and he's very good at what he does. I sleep in a bed he made. Wonderful. I didn't expect a furniture maker in a town this small. He's always busy, Vicki told him. But he's really good. Our kitchen chairs were made by him. And he made Ma's kitchen cabinets. I wonder if he'd have any free time where he could come and work on cabinets with me, he said. I'll find him and talk to him. I know he and his family live south of town, but that's all I know. I can figure it out from there, he said. Thank you. He leaned down and kissed her since they were alone in the house. Have you been busy this week? She nodded. I've been doing Ma's portion of the chores as well as my own. Well, Barbara and I have split Ma's portion, but my sister does not move as fast as I'd like. Is your Ma sick? He asked, frowning. She shook her head. No, she's in the parlor making a dress for me for our wedding, and one for Barbara as well. She didn't mention there would also be a nightgown she was sure he would love, because that was her surprise to him. Are you making chicken and dumplings for supper? He asked, his face lighting up. I can't believe I didn't notice as soon as I walked in the house. I am. I've never had them, but Henri gave me her receipt, and I'm making the effort. Hopefully, by the time we marry, I'll be able to make your favorite meal. He grinned. Sounds delicious. Her Ma walked out of the parlor then, rubbing her eyes. Dress is done, she said. You should try it on later tonight. She smiled at John. Good to see you. He nodded. I can't go for a full week without seeing my girl, so I'll be here on Wednesday nights for supper. I hope that's all right. It's very all right, Ma said with a smile. We're happy to feed you whenever you want to come. Oh, I love your jerky, John said. Vicki gave me a bag of it, and it's wonderful. I've just about finished it off. It's perfect when I need a bite of food while I'm working on the house. I'm glad to hear it. Abby's jerky is every bit as good as mine, she said with a smile. But she's a wonder in the kitchen compared to me. I'm proud of her for listening to Henri and applying everything she said. Vicki smiled and kissed her mother's cheek. Thanks, Ma. Cooking is a lot easier after all those lessons from Henri. You went for more than the rest of us, if I remember correctly. You kept going when the rest of us stopped, because you wanted to be able to cook for the man who would someday be in your life. And I'm cooking for him today, Vicki said, looking at John and smiling. And I sure appreciate all the effort you went to so you can cook for me. I'm really excited to try supper tonight. We'll see how it compares to my ma's. Barbara hurried in from the garden, slamming the front door, and immediately calling out, Sorry, Ma. The wind caught it. Vicki shook her head. She says that every time she comes in, because she always slams the door. John chuckled. Ma called to Barbara, Come wash your hands. You can help your sister serve supper. Yes, Ma. Barbara called back, just a bit too loud. Vicki loved her sister, but she needed to learn to be a bit less exuberant at times. Vicki filled a bowl with the chicken and dumplings. She would have tried them, but she didn't really know how they were supposed to taste. Barbara washed her hands and carried in the stack of plates Vicki had set on the counter. Pa's not here yet, Vicki said, frowning. He's milking, and then he'll be right in, Barbara told her. I saw him as I was finishing planting the watermelon. Is that the last of the garden? Ma asked. Barbara nodded. Finally. But it's been dry, so I think we'll need to start watering tomorrow. She looked exhausted at the very idea. Vicki smiled. You make supper tomorrow, and I'll do extra time in the garden. Perfect. Barbara said. I hate gardening. I love it. We'll get through this. John liked how Vicki had just jumped in and offered to take on the burden her sister hated. He carried the bread into the dining room and set it on the table. Barbara looked at him for a moment. Why are you doing women's work? He shrugged. It's how I grew up. All of us kids had the same chores to do, and we did them without complaining they were for the other gender. I can even cook some simple meals. That's different, Barbara said. I guess it is. With the chicken and dumplings, Vicki had heated up some canned green beans and made several loaves of bread. We're almost out of butter, Vicki told her ma. I guess that'll be one of your chores tomorrow, won't it? Ma asked. Vicki nodded. Sure will. She didn't mind churning butter when she could do it on the porch. Then she was outside, but doing work anyway. She hated to feel lazy, but always wanted to be outdoors. Something about the trail had changed her, making her want to spend more and more time in nature. Ma looked at Vicki for a moment. Would you like to take a rooster and 5 of my chickens? She asked. Vicki nodded. I would love that. Ma is amazing with chickens, she told John. You've never seen anyone who can do what she does. Every egg is double yolks. We'll be truly blessed to have some of her flock. Well, then I looked forward to taking some of your chickens. And I look forward to being able to take care of them. Another excuse to be outside. John laughed. You can always help me build the barn and the fences. I would, Vicki said, nodding. He shook his head. I don't think that would be wise. You're going to have enough to do to stay busy between tending the chickens and the garden, keeping the house up, and feeding me. Truthfully, feeding me might just be a full-time job. Vicki smiled. It's one I'm sure I'll enjoy. But she thought she might make a fire pit to cook on. She wouldn't cook everything on it, of course, but there were several things she knew would be fine over a fire. I plan to get a few hogs too, but I haven't had the chance yet. Talk to the Applebyes, Ma and Vicki said at the same time. I will talk to the Applebyes. Do they have more than they can use? So many more, Vicki said. The youngest son, Bastian, isn't great with people, but he is truly wonderful with animals. They've got quite a lot of hogs, and more every day. Maybe we can take a couple after they're weaned. I know Emma said their sow had 10 pigs last week. Wow, John said. I'd take 2 or 3 of them and we can have pork as well as the beef from the steers we butcher. Pa walked into the house then, and they all sat around the table. After the prayer, John asked Pa about the hogs. Do you think the Applebyes would sell me a few hogs so I can start my own sounder of pigs? I think they would. Jacob is always saying there are too many, and he doesn't want to build a larger pen. They use the hogs for food, but I don't think they usually sell them for the meat, so there's no reason to have so many. Would I talk to Jacob or Bastian? John asked. I'd talk to Jacob. Bastian isn't the world's best conversationalist. Sounds good. He noticed then that Vicki was watching him. What? He asked. I learned to make a new dish just for you, and I want to know if you like it, she said. Oops. Sorry. Was excited about the prospect of hogs. He stuck a fork into his chicken and dumplings and took his first bite. He closed his eyes and relished the taste. Much better than my ma's. Maybe even better than Mrs. Pruitt's, but she could give you a run for your money. Vicki smiled. I'm so glad. It would be a while before they had a chicken she could butcher to make a dish like that, but she could always buy one from a neighbor. Very good job. Ma smiled at Vicki. My Abby sure can cook, can't she? Vicki wasn't so sure why her ma looked so proud that she could cook when she'd had nothing to do with it, other than teaching her the wrong way to do everything. After supper, John looked at Vicki. Since you cooked, you can walk with me, right? Vicki looked at her ma, who nodded. Yes, I can. As they left the house, John asked, You seemed hesitant about whether you could walk with me or not. Ma is doing all the sewing, so she's been skipping household chores, but she said it was all right. Oh, I didn't think of that. Am I causing her too much work? Vicki shook her head. She's the one who insisted on making me a new dress when I have a perfectly good Sunday dress I could marry in. I'm not worried. Ma would rather sew than do anything, but I could tell her eyes were bothering her earlier. It's probably good that she's taking a sewing break and doing something else. Sewing bothers her eyes? Vicki laughed. If you do anything for a long period of time, something in your body is going to be bothered. As much as I love gardening, when I weed for hours, I get blisters on my fingers. I guess that's true. They'd reached the wooded area, which he was starting to think of as the kissing place. He pulled her into his arms and leaned down to kiss her, not asking permission this time because he knew her well enough to know she would always welcome a kiss. When they parted, he sighed. I want to kiss you when I wake up every day and before I sleep at night. I have to get that house finished enough that you can move in. I'd sleep under the stars with you, she said softly, moving in for another kiss. His touch ignited a fire inside her that she never wanted to go out. His hands roamed over her back and cupped her bottom, pulling her into him. Finally, he groaned. You're killing me, Vicki. She sighed. I just like it so much when you touch me and kiss me. Please get help and finish that house. I'm glad I'm not alone in wanting to make love with you so much it hurts. She nodded. It's uncomfortable. I wish we were already married. I do too. But we're not. He sighed. Let's walk back to the house and I'll say goodnight. Then I can be up before the sun tomorrow. I'll have breakfast and be at work by 6:30 or so. Now that everything is walled in, I don't have to wait for sun up, but I do need to wait for breakfast. I'll get you some more jerky, she said. I wasn't trying to get more jerky from you, but it would be appreciated. I want to get as much done as I can as quickly as possible. I wonder if your father would agree to let you marry me with no stove or really anything to cook on. She giggled. I know he wouldn't, but I like that idea. He put his arm around her as they walked back up to the house. I'll be here at 5:30 on Saturday night for the dance. I'm not a great dancer, but I'll do anything to spend more time with you. You are a good man, John. You make me feel like I'm something special. He stopped walking. Of course, you're special. Do not ever think you're not. She shrugged. I'm the middle daughter. Who cares about the middle daughter? She asked. I do, he said. I think you're very special. I saw you across the church, and I knew I needed to meet you. I thought of nothing but you after I left Clover Creek and came back here, so I could settle and have you for my wife. How could you possibly think you're not special? I'm just not the best at anything. I'm a good cook, but not the best cook. I'm a good friend, but not the best friend. I'm a good gardener, but not the best gardener. I never seem to measure up to those around me. What if you're second best at everything? He asked. Would that work? She nodded. I think so. I'm being silly. Don't mind me. He hugged her to him and kissed the top of her head. You'll be the best wife I could ever ask for. You'll be the best mother to our children. And you're going to be the best lover any man could ask for, he whispered. She smiled up at him. You might be right about all that. At the house, he kissed her once more. 5:30 on Saturday night. Wear your dancing shoes. I have 2 pair, and they're both for dancing, she said. He laughed and waved a hand in farewell. Vicki watched him drive away before going back into the house. Can I help with the dishes? Vicki called. They're finished, Ma said. But go in your room and try on that new dress. Vicki nodded, walking into her room. Instead of pink, her mother had made her a red and white gingham dress. It was absolutely beautiful, and she knew it would look perfect with her dark hair. She quickly stripped down to her underwear and pulled the dress on over her head. It fit perfectly as all of the dresses Ma made did. She stepped out of her room and twirled so Ma could see it all. That looks very good. Ma stood up and walked toward her. Not too snug, but not too loose either. I did make it so it could be let out for when you're expecting. Vicki hugged her mother. I love it, Ma.